Stuart, please.
You're ready for me?
You're up in the mountains.
Yeah, thanks to Stephen. And to Jijuan for arranging this. And hi to Valerie. I haven't seen her for a long time, and haven't seen Deanna for a long time either. Okay, so I thought I would talk about the influence of neurophysiology on cybernetics. My interest is in science as opposed to the arts, and y'all can figure out how the two fit together. The reason I wanted to emphasize neurophysiology is because it's not talked about very much, and it's the foundation of second-order cybernetics, which a lot of people are interested in. But a lot of people assume that second-order cybernetics has something to do with methods, scientific methods like statistics or computer simulation, and that's not what second-order cybernetics is about. So, or at least that's not the origin of it. So let me try to explain that, see how successful I am. Are you going to show some slides, Jijuan?
You want me to show it? Okay, I can do that.
Well, I have some slides
But
too.
you just need to let me know when to switch the slide.
Yeah, okay. Well, what are the first title slides, The Influence of Neurophysiology on Cybernetics?
Wait a second, I will do the share screen and bring up your slide.
So at the beginning, while you're doing that, I'll start talking.
Yeah, go ahead.
Cybernetics got started. It was mostly interested in, there you go, in control systems, things like thermostats, automatic pilots, automatic production systems, etc. But there was a group, including McCulloch, von Forster, Maturana, and so forth, who were interested in cognition. So they wanted to use many of the ideas that had been developed to deal in engineering, to deal with control systems and apply that knowledge to the brain. So they studied the brain to try to figure out how it worked. So let me just run through a few experiments quickly, and then I'll point to the implications, which are important for the philosophy of science. So you have an image, if you go to that first image, there you go, of a person. So you have an eyeball on the right-hand side looking at a person, and the image of the person is upside down on the retina of the observer, but we don't perceive the object as being upside down. The brain conveniently turns things around for us. There's the well-known blind spot experiment where if you close one eye, the one on the left here, so you only have your right eye, and you focus on the spot on the left, then the spot on the right will at some point fall on the place where the optic nerve leaves the retina, and there are no receptor cells there. So you might expect that there is a black hole in your vision. But as you look out if you close one eye, look out at the world, you don't see any black holes. And that's because the brain very conveniently fills it in with whatever is nearby. Okay, and then there are a number of other experiments I could go through, but let's go down to the kittens. This was an experiment that was conducted. You have some newborn kittens. You have an experimental apparatus. It's a wagon with a sort of T-bar at the end of at the two ends of the T-bar, there's a sort of canvas bag. One of the bags has holes in the bottom, so the kitten in that bag, his feet stretched through and he stands on the wagon. But in the other case, the kitten's legs are up, so he's not standing. He's just sitting there, swinging around. And then you drag this wagon around for some days or weeks. I don't know how long it took. And then you take the kittens out and then you look at their behavior. And the question is, how is their behavior different? Somebody want to tell me?
That's a torture for the first one.
The one on the left? Yeah.
One on the left.
Yeah. Well, the one on the right behaves normally. The one on the left, if you put it on a table, it'll walk off the edge of the table and go kerplop on the floor. If you put it on the ground, it'll bump into things. So basically, the one on the left acts as though it is blind. The one on the right is normal. Now, the reason that happens is because your vision is a combination of what your eyes are seeing and what your body and your bones and muscles and nerves are feeling. And it's a combination of sensory perceptions. And the kitten on the left didn't have the full complement of sensory perceptions, so it doesn't have a full complement of a three-dimensional world in which it interacts. Okay, now let's go down to the bottom.
Let me add one sentence. The fate of this left kitten is exactly the fate of Chinese people and the CCP rule. They were all domesticated to behave in the way that the rulers want them to behave. Okay, next one.
Well, that's a very interesting and good point, I think, because democracy and self-government require practice. That's really quite obvious. I mean, one of the reasons Russia became an authoritarian society was because that's all they knew. They had been under the Tsar, which is a very authoritarian repressive system. So when the communists came to power and they wanted to set up a government, what kind of government did they do? Well, they had an authoritarian repressive system. And so how do you work your way out of that? It takes time. Okay, so let's look at the image on the screen now. So let's say that's your visual field, and you have a patient and a doctor. Now, the patient is an injured war veteran, and he has received an injury in the back part of his head, that's the occipital cortex, so his vision is impaired. However, he makes no complaint about what he can see. He thinks he sees just fine, but he has trouble walking. And when he walks, he sort of drags one leg. So he puts one leg forward and then drags the other leg up, and one leg forward and drags the other leg up, and so forth. And this was a puzzle to the doctors. They said, well, he has no injury in his motor part of his nervous system, so why is this happening? So one day the doctor goes in, the doctor's on the right-hand side, and what you're seeing there is the visual field where the outer circle indicates the peripheral vision, and the inner circle indicates the focus vision, where you focus your attention. Okay, so the doctor enters, he's holding a clipboard and a pen or a pencil, and he addresses the veteran. He says, "Hi, Joe, how are you doing?" He says, "Oh, I'm fine, Doc, how are you?" And so he asks him a series of questions, and the doctor notes them down on his clipboard. And then when he's done, he says, the doctor says, "Would you like a cigarette?" And the patient says, "Yes." So the doctor, now if you can look at me, he puts his pen in his shirt pocket and takes out a package of cigarettes and holds them out to the patient. And the patient is looking at the doctor, but the patient doesn't reach for the cigarette. And so the doctor says, "Here they are." And the patient says, "Where?" And the doctor says, "In my hand." And the patient says, "No, they're not." And the doctor says, "What is in my hand?" And the patient says, "A pencil." All the time, the patient is looking directly at the doctor and the doctor's hand. So now the question is, how did the doctor fix the patient? How did he help the patient walk?
No idea.
Only I know, but I cannot say that.
Go ahead, Jason.
Well, the therapy was invented by he realizing the patient had a strange-shaped blind spot. So the way to rebuild the coordination is to cover his eyes and to learn negotiate with the world by his other sensory channels, so that he can re-establish a coordinated action.
Yeah, right. In other words, if you take the premise that you need a coordination between your sensory apparatus and your muscles and your movement activities. What the patient is missing is vision. And so you replace that with hearing or the balance mechanisms. So you blindfold the patient so that he's not relying upon vision to establish his position in space. He's relying on his sensory apparatus. And he's trying to, I mean, you can walk across a room with your eyes closed, you know, look where you're going first, and then walk across the room with your eyes closed. And you can do that quite well because you're using the balance mechanisms in your ears. All of which is just simply to reinforce the notion that the brain constructs a reality, the brain constructs a stable reality, and that's one of many neurophysiological experiments that helped this group of people understand how the brain constructs a reality. Okay, now, how is that related to science, say? Okay, so to learn how our knowledge, whether our knowledge is true, as we don't want to do in science, we have to compare our perception with reality. That would be a nice thing to do, right? That's what we think we're doing when we do experiments. We're comparing our theory with data. But our knowledge of the world is mediated by our senses. And sometimes our senses mislead us. They tell us things are there that aren't there, and so forth. So the notion that you can compare theory to experiment and have an independent source of information is flawed by the neurophysiological nature of our perception of the world. So let's go on to the next one. Oh, well, so then Heinz says, this, I have a longer version of this, but I've shortened it for Jishuan's purposes. Heinz once said, the logic of the world is the logic of descriptions of the world. Perception is the computation of descriptions of the world. Cognition is the computation of computation of computation, and so forth. Okay, so any questions about that? The interesting, when Heinz says you have to take account of the observer, what he means by that is you have to take account of what the observer can know and what he cannot know, and the fact that the reality that the observer is working with is the result of the experiences and the interpretations of that particular observer. It doesn't seem very surprising, but it's often overlooked. I'll take questions.
Would you agree that the whole point can be condensed into that ancient story of blind man feeling about the elephant?
Well, that's a good story. I think there's more than one blind man in that case, because each one sees something different. Yeah, it's a very important story about perception and what we know and what other people know. Yeah, but there's more to it than that.
So
what more?
Well, I see personally a contradiction, and I'm really curious how you're going to resolve that, Stuart, because what you're basically saying, everything, there is no fact. There are interpretations within a priori conceived frameworks, whatever they are, determined by your prior history. So I found it interesting how you immediately said the brain is responsible without qualifying what you meant by the brain, because for the same money, one can say the body is responsible. And what I heard you say when you said the brain, that you immediately jumped on the materialistic bandwagon of saying there were particles in the beginning and they kept on colliding until we came in existence. but there is also another narrative that talks about energy fields and or fields in general, and that's like totally different. And my understanding is, in this day and age, we're kind of figuring out how to explore that other narrative. So and so then the brain becomes like a problematic term, because it unless you qualify what you mean by the brain, because there is so okay, so I'll give it back to you. What do you mean by the brain?
Well, that's shorthand for the nervous system, or the body, if you want, and so forth, because the brain integrates information coming from eyes, ears, muscles, nerves, and memory. One of the things that's pointed out by Francisco Varela and others is that the number of neurons going from the brain to the occipital cortex is 10 times greater than the number of neurons going from the eyeballs to the occipital cortex. So the interpretive apparatus in the occipital cortex is much larger than the raw data coming from the eyes, and that would be similarly for the ears.
Can I come in?
Yeah.
I would like to make the point that I also feel that tension in your storyline about, on the one hand, the brain, and on the other hand, what is now up front, the logic of the world is the logic of descriptions of the world. The brain is not a description of the world, and the logic of the world is not at the level of the brain, but at the level of interactions. It's a discursive logic. Yeah, in my background, of course, Niklas Luhmann is here very important, to make this distinction between, on the one hand, agency, and on the other hand, the dynamics of communication, which do not have to be at the same level.
Yeah, no, I quite agree. Well, going back to Jamie's earlier point about objectivity and so forth, I mean, it's very common to define objectivity as shared subjectivity. That
Maturana has nice words for that, interobjectivity.
Yeah. So if you get several
to this,
observers,
I would respond, it doesn't exist a shared objectivity, and we had that experience here, like Jason and I and Michael Lisak. There is no shared. there will be always a difference, and so anyway, just.
Well, that's the fun of it, you know. I mean, the whole reason that we have a group of people discussing something and all of us are different from each other.
Yeah.
And all of us have different takes on the same material, you know, back to the blind people and the elephant. You know, this is interesting. You know.
The interesting part is that we
but
can
interesting,
coordinate.
pardon? But
The
interesting, but
part-
also, where do you go next? Everybody comes with their own perception of reality. How does that really facilitate not just discussion? I can understand how it facilitates discussion among many different perceptions, et cetera. But what about after that? What if there is a need to make a decision or come to consensus? How does that happen?
lots of different ways. Usually there's somebody who's the boss or the elected official, and they make a decision, and then you decide down the road whether to re-elect them. But the definition of objectivity is shared subjectivity. In other words, there's only subjectivity, and the way what you're trying to do is to get agreement. And one of the ways to get agreement is to try to get people to agree that their particular individual perception of the world is not the correct, absolute, final word.
Mm-hmm.
But the sharing itself is a piece of work. So you cannot say it is a sum of subjectivity, it is a sharing of subjectivity, and then a logic steps in, and that's just on the screen. Your quote to Heinz van Förster.
Yeah.
Who makes that point?
Right, exactly.
So there is also There's also another definition of objectivity, as Karl Popper is trying to convince us, and he object-like. And so then objective knowledge is not shared subjectivity, but it's knowledge as it exists as an artifact in a book. And that becomes an object in that it is non-changing and it's out there and we are interacting with it and we have all different takes. And now Popper makes a distinction between the reality that we need to make decisions, whether we understand the consequences or not, we make the decisions. But then over time, we develop the ability to do research and self-reflect. And so then we develop models of decision makers. And that started like 500 years ago. And so we continue. And these models are abstractions on paper that are used to communicate across time and space, and that help us better understand what we're doing. So I'm just trying to say there's another definition of objectivity that doesn't require to assume that everyone agrees, that actually acknowledge that everyone may disagree.
Okay.
And whoever made the decision first, whatever, was responsible for how things evolved. And we're all trying to understand better that process before we blow up the world, I guess.
What we are looking at is trying to move the idea of cognition, decision, action to the left, where there's observation, perception, and orientation. And that orientation. Let me give you a story. This past weekend, I had the privilege of seeing someone I hadn't seen for a long time that I used to work with. His name was John Domenico Pico. He wrote a book called Man Without a Gun. He worked at the UN and helped and precipitated the end of a conflict, which is a way of interaction, a discussion with weapons. Pico was asked by the King of Saudi Arabia to meet with him privately. The head of the UN said, Pico, why does he want to meet with you? You're just a low-level person. But the head of the UN, Pierre's, said, okay, just go see him. Good luck, hoping you come back. This was after 6.5 years of a war that no one was winning major things. It was locked in. People's perception, fight, stimulus response, gladiator pit. How do you get out of it? $1 billion a month was going from Saudi Arabia to Saddam Hussein to fight there. And the king said, Pico, what ideas do you have? And he's sitting there, I'm just a low-level diplomat. But his history was determinative of ending that war, and I'll get to that. He said, well, your kingship, you can stop giving money to Saddam. You can have a page in history to stop a bloody war. The king looked at that and said, oh, I could do that, couldn't I? I'm not sending a billion. 5 days after that meeting, the war stopped. Then later on, he then went, the Ayatollah called him, said, Pico, come see me alone. This is Iran. Pico goes there not knowing whether he's going to come back. And the Ayatollah says, what can I do for you, Pico? Pico says, me, $1 million, a rug, what do I, what? And of course, the Ayatollah says, there have been some naughty boys out there in Lebanon that have taken some hostages. I think we go see this man and he will take you. Who's going to meet me? Don't ask questions. Pico was then taken to meet with the terrorists that had taken the American hostages. He then got the release of all of them. Now, what was essential in the story? Pico was an Italian. He grew up in northern Italy His grandmother was buried half in one country and half in another country. 3 countries come together: Yugoslavia, Italy, Switzerland, Austria there. I'm sorry, Austria there. His village was right on the border. His best friends were communists, which were a terrible plight to his mother, whose father was killed by the communists. But he had, and in that area, they had a unique language that spanned the Alps. That was not French, English, Swiss, any other language. He had to think about adjacencies. So where Saddam Hussein and the Ayatollah were battling it out, he was able to see something that raised to a higher level because he had the diversity, the requisite variety in cybernetic language, that allowed him to see a perception that was different, because the king didn't know what to do, Ayatollah didn't know what to do, but he was able to just be a medium for resolution. And what's important about that idea is he has to live on the perceptual, observational, orientational side of the spectrum, not the decision, not the action, the logics that are locked into war. Now, Pico now is suffering from Alzheimer's, but he may not remember my name after he talked to me. He knows who I am, but he remembers all the stories of what he did. And that perceptual, observational, orientation world is what we need a rigor about. And that's where arts, perception, both that Stuart talks about, that Stephen talks about, is essential for us to really think through what this cybernetic next field is.
Communicatics.
Loet, do you want to expand or clarify or what Lowell said?
Yes, I want to add another anecdote.
Okay.
And the anecdote is about the Irish peace process. So, you know, there had been war in Northern Ireland for decades, yeah? And then an American senator who had an Irish background, Mitchell, he managed to write a peace treaty which can be read by the Irish, the Catholics, differently from the Protestants. So the words are there on the paper, but it enables them to have 2 readings of that document. And that has something to do with your Pico story, to learn to talk more languages.
That's good.
Yes, that's consistent with, I had an aunt who grew up in Russia and spoke French and came to the United States and
oh, but this was all in English, eh? This was languages in a metaphorical sense.
yes,
Because the peace treaty is in English, and the Irish spoke English and the Brits spoke English.
She knew several languages. She was telling me how she worked on the Law of the Sea Treaty. And so I said, tell me about that. And she said, well, the trick is in translation. You have to pick the right words such that each side can agree with the translation into their language. Even though it may be very different for a different language. Your skill in languages is really tested when you're trying to do a diplomatic treaty that everybody can accept. And it all has to do with multiple meanings of words and historical context, etc.
There's a beautiful article by Yugo Fujikaki in Social Science Information and 90s, where she describes how Japanese people are able to compromise without using languages by making a table. So in the table they have boxes where everybody can fit in their descriptions, and this logic of description then begins to become dynamic. I don't have it precisely in mind, but it is.
Can you send me a reference on that?
Yes.
Please send it to the group.
Yes, I'll do that. Yuko.
Jamie.
Amy?
Yeah, another question for Stuart and perhaps also Lud. How do you just, is Lud the correct
Yes,
pronunciation? Yeah, okay.
yes.
So what about gestalt shifting is this first for Stuart and maybe also for Lud, in your model of the mind or the brain, what does the concept or the process of gestalt shifting, what sort of place does this have? Because I recognize when you have a peace process, you have to kind of look at it from all perspectives. So that means one mind who can imagine this is how an agent provocateur would act, this is how this information would be introduced, but this is how people are authentic in their intentions, and this is an enemy, and this is a friend, and these are all different ways of, these are all different gestalts, so to say. So what is your view on the role of gestalt shifting, and that we need to pay more attention to the experience that people have with gestalt shifting? So first for Stuart and then for Lud. Yeah.
I'll pass it.
Why, Stuart? Because I want to know
I
what
haven't
you
given
think.
much thought to gestalt shifting. I agree with what you said. I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
If I may add, nevertheless, something, I would say gestalt switching is defined at the level of the mind. Well, what we are talking here about is at the level of social systems, of coordination systems. And also coordination systems can go through crisis and new forms may come up, like new regimes. But it may be important to allocate your wordings to the right system. So gestalt switching, for example, Thomas Kuhn used the word paradigm switching. I think that's already where we are much more talking about how people come in, follow social events in which new forms are possible.
Yes, now I deliberately said gestalt shifting because I wanted to make a connection with gestalt psychology as opposed to cognitive psychology. And then I wanted to point out that any system is always a collection or a network of minds. There is no system without minds. So I
No,
don't see the
but
distinction.
there are no minds without atoms. There
Well,
are no
no,
atoms.
atoms we know is a construct. A mind is something we use today to kind of make sense of what we're doing. And atoms is a story that we can trace back, and a story that has been very useful to us, but also a story that in the 20th century had to deal with the contradiction when the what is it, the particle wave contradictions were, yeah.
May I make my point? The micro operation of a mind is different from the micro operation of the social system. The micro operation of the social system, I would use the words double contingency for that in the
Yes.
Pearsonian terms. That is as follows: ego expects alter to entertain expectations as he does himself, or she does herself. That's a different micro operation. That's the micro operation of interacting expectations. And that's different from the Homo economicus on the one side and the psychological unit of analysis, which is the thought, the consciousness on the other side. I think in cybernetics we have a need to make those distinctions between
Yes.
different types of logics.
And
And that brings us back to you.
Yeah.
I want to say I completely agree with you. That is second order cybernetics. We look at the system. It's a system of minds.
Yes.
And I was just trying to point out a certain characteristic of the mind that may be helpful to understand how the system of minds is working. And not to forget, we have also artifacts, and now we have the laws of physics that we cannot escape. Yeah.
I wanted to say regarding Gestalt shifting, Lowell referenced the law of requisite variety, which is very much in play here. I mean, if you're a practitioner of photography or the violin or any medium of expression, you need to have more states that your instrument is capable of capturing, more levels of light. You know, if you have a camera with lots of ranges of time of exposure and lots of ranges of how close the iris can shift down, then you're capable of dealing with greater and greater environmental conditions. If you have an instrument, if you have a language that's capable of a lot of different states, then you're more likely to be able to understand what's presented to you. So a language of language, you know, in a sense, what you were referring to when you're talking about diplomacy is a language of languages. That the more languages, the more dialects, the more shades of meaning, the more ways that you know other people might interpret the same word differently, then the better equipped you are for Gestalt shifting. And so practice, you know, somehow these people, like Senator Mitchell and Lowell's friend Pico, people who have managed to do well in that field, are somehow capable of a lot of requisite variety in the languages that they can hear and their ability to translate.
Let me give you an example of what Pico went to in another negotiation with the top terrorists that Israel, Europe, United States wanted at any cost. He was thrown into the back of a Toyota, blindfolded, handcuffed. And for 2 hours, he went up to the Lebanon mountains to this terrorist that was wanted by everyone. He gets out, and the first thing, and the one thing he told me, as a diplomat with terrorists, just like your mother used to say, you must have clean underwear, because the first thing they do is strip you to make sure you don't have any weapons, you know, organizing, etc. So of course he's stripped. He is surrounded by 7 people with AK-47s with their fingers on the trigger, just waiting for the top dude to say, kill him. And the top terrorist says, why are you here? These are not your people. These were British and Americans, etc. These are not your people. Why are you here? And how he answered the next sentence determined whether he'd live or die. Now, how did he then answer that? He says, in the future, when my son meets your son, I want them to be meeting across the table to be negotiating olive oil or whatever else in the world that they are work with, and not with a gun pointed at one another. He shifted the Gestalt from conflict and the idea, why the hell are you helping these people are not yours, to the humanity, to the level of humanity. That was a Gestalt shift that saved his life.
Great, nice story.
That's
One
good.
other story that I think will help us and deal with Lutz's concept about nature is how viruses think, particularly in the COVID-19 world. A virus, which is not actually a living organism, but has to then clomb onto something that is living, is like in pneumonia. Pneumonia has 3 forms of communication. The first form is identity, me and not me. I know who me is and not me. Number two is quanta. How many me's are there? And that's why pneumonia is known as the old man's blessing, because it kills you quickly. Because what happens is the third aspect of communication, which is, and I cannot conceptualize how this is done. An organism that has no nose, mouth, sense, perceptual, cognitive, neurological aspect. It knows when the body is weakest. It has a landscape of the perceptual ecology that is fitting into to know when to take all those elements. And this is what's so fascinating about COVID. It hides in the corners of the lungs elsewhere and then attacks in unison. It does the bugle charge. So how it does that, I have no idea. It is an RNA lipid fat and a protein. That's all it is. But that RNA, which is a messenger, is an interactive, DNA is the template, the little Bible. RNA is the interactive aspect with going to the chemicals, going to the cells, etc. So all it is a messenger. That's what a virus is, and has a form of communication. And the way it gestalt shifts is not individually. It doesn't think like humans. It shifts only through evolution, a larger interaction that says, I'm 1918, I'm going to hit young boys, young men and women. Now the COVID hits older people because it's interacted and say, here's the sweet spot to get in the humans. So those are just two stories that may help us think through what is the hell we're trying to advance here.
May I make a suggestion?
Please.
So the messenger in the coronavirus, it may be useful to think about how codes of communication structure our communication, because they are also nothing. They're not something external to us, or they are not there. And in a way, they are able to steer our communication, to function as messages. I haven't thought it through, but it's something that would be the direction I would go.
There's something about that messaging as an RNA structure that is as powerful as what Pico did with shifting, evolutionarily changing the conversation to not being killed.
I sometimes, when I gave a course, I sometimes started with putting a banknote of €5 on the table and to discuss with my student what that thing was. Because it is not only a banknote, it is the possibility to buy something. So it's something which gets a function in the communication. And the same may be the case with a virus, although a virus has a different material existence, of course, than for a banknote.
So, Lowell, you mentioned briefly protein. So as not just RNA, there is a shell of protein around it. And I think maybe what's happening is there is this continuous messaging of the protein, and it's a very sophisticated messaging system, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's non-stop sending signals, and then it gets a response, and then it has this total sophisticated way of, and so that gets to the gestalt shifting that is very high level in terms of interacting with the environment. Yeah, a very smart virus.
Right. The intelligence of a strip of RNA protein in a fat is competing with our smarts. We're losing.
We're losing, right?
Dina and Valerie, please contribute. And I love having these number of women on this meeting. This is great.
That's all right. I asked all my questions last week, Lowell.
Okay.
And I'm just
Dina,
taking
any
it all
observations?
One thing's interesting, thinking back to Stephen's presentation and then to Stuart's, and there was a theme for me internally that kept coming up, and it had to do with the connection and the ability to listen and you can't engage and you can't connect unless you listen, and whatever form that listening is in. And that really came up to me. Several years ago, I went to a local university for a jazz night. All the music professors got together, and every year on the same day, they would do a jazz presentation. And what I took away from that, it related to teamwork and management and organizations, because you would see them flowing in and out of the lead, and they would just synergistically hand that off. And then they also were supporting each other, proud of each other. Their eyes would light up. They were connected with each other, and they were listening. And I think that whole listening piece is just so important. And we have to develop that, because I don't think we naturally have that. So that's.
I would agree 100% with that. That also came across for me too, and I was really quite interested in Stephen's presentation because of the arts connection. And I think one of the pieces that I also come away with, not only is listening important, but he also mentioned that the result of people coming together created an organized and coordinated sound after these many different realities, if you want to call it that, or these ways of looking at the world came together, and ways of looking at the world because of listening too. So that to me was very important. It's just something, you know, to focus on. Importance of listening, and then the importance of what do you do with the listening.
Yeah, let me just add something that I've probably told the members of this group more than once. But the way this interest in perception became of interest to Heinz von Forster and Warren McCulloch and the others had to do with the cultural difference between the United States and the European community. That in Europe, people study the history of philosophy in high school for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And they have to pass an exam on what the different philosophers have said. And so they show up at the university having an understanding of the history of philosophy and how the different disciplines have emerged from different philosophical lines of thought. Americans don't have that. And what Americans have is one philosophy of realism, not this second philosophy. So they're missing the dialogue between Plato and Aristotle. Mm-hmm. They're missing the allegory of the cave, or they don't understand the allegory of the cave. So we're materialists. We always think about a material embodiment of some idea.
And we're missing Lao Tzu and Nagarjuna.
Excuse me?
And we're missing Lao Tzu and Nagarjuna.
Right. Well, I'll settle for being able to talk to the Europeans. You know, the Asians are another challenge. So if we can get over that, that would be great. But I've encountered this quite recently at the National Academy of Sciences. They have their meetings open to the public, so I go and listen to some of them. And they're quite unaware of this difference in the educational systems in the United States and Europe. They recently did a study. It was called Incorporating the Arts and Humanities in STEM Education, where STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And they wanted to do this, and they thought, oh, that's a great idea. So they looked around for examples of programs that did all that across the United States, and they found some very innovative and exciting programs. And then as they were concluding their comment, I said, you know, I think there's a shortcut here. We could do what the Europeans do. We could teach the history of philosophy in high school, so that when our university students show up at the university, they have a broader perspective and they know the origins of these different points of view. But we don't have that. And so what you have, and it continues on to the present day, so that in the field of systems and cybernetics, in the United States, there are two societies. There's the Society for General Systems Research that became the International Society of System Sciences, and the Cybernetics Society. In Europe, they meet together. Over here, they meet separately. And the reason they meet separately is because they yell and scream at each other, because the other side just doesn't know science. They don't know how to do science. And so
But
if we
over
could get
here,
over that,
but
it would
over
be,
here in Europe, they don't understand each other.
well, Europe
We need the
has its own
Americans. We
problems.
need the Americans.
I think, yeah, so there are always challenges.
So I think this may have something to do with the computational theory of the mind. The way that I've studied this evolution, I think in the 1950s, it kind of started taking over after the Second World War, that people were looking for a common ground, and that they kind of settled on the machine metaphor. And the computer was kind of the perfect example of a machine. And so now we have psychology that's being taken over by cognitive psychology. That's kind of becoming quietly the dominant paradigm. And it has been connected with evolutionary psychology, with Steven Pinker. And then you have the evolutionary people who want to make everything evolutionary. So the subtlety of how to argue differences is kind of disappearing once you're in this machine metaphor, because then the machine, it needs to be consistent with the machine metaphor, and otherwise it doesn't exist. And so the machine metaphor is the rational actor model, and is Boolean logic, and is mathematics as the language, and logic as the language that helps us solve problems without acknowledging all the things that are happening in our mind, so to say.
What's interesting about the machine metaphor and the history of philosophy is that each generation likes to arrogate unto the human mind or body and or the rest of the universe the metaphor of whatever machine is currently
Yeah.
popular in that culture. So in the 18th century, we had the clockwork universe and the whole notion of, you know, wheels and gears was imported into our idea of mind. And in the 19th century, you know, the early Freudian work was all based on the idea of the steam engine, and that,
Yeah.
you know, here you have these forces under pressure in an enclosed inner space, and then they explode, you know, and then in early cybernetics we had the telephone and the telegraph were a big deal in communication theory, and of course now you'll see New York Times science reporter reporting something about brain research saying, well, of course the brain is a computer and so has discovered, you know, how this part of it works, you know. So we just love to take these metaphors from whatever favorite machines we have at the moment and think that's how the mind and body work.
So the question is how we go from the age of information to what we've talked about today, which is an age of communication, interaction, listening, etc. Because there is something radically different about taking the low-hanging fruit, using feedback circuitry, going back to the history that Stephen talked about originally. Everyone, including that virus and us, have a clothesline that goes back in history. And so we're repeating certain circuits. And then we talked about how do you get out of a circuit when you're trapped in it. And that's important. If I could just share a screen about what we're trying to accomplish here. Yeah, there we go. I'd mentioned this before, which is a triple loop research method. And the first one with the reds are all about how this model is applied, the practice, and then there's a gap. and that's not working. And then science comes in and said, this is my model. Well, then let's change the model, and et cetera. The problem is there is something larger than just the conceptual abstraction, the model, et cetera, which is that third loop, triple loop. What are the issues raised by this practice, which is trying to step out of your paradigm and going to a different approach? Does this come up? This is what Stephen shared on his Facebook page. I think this week, Stephen. This was what, a 1959 version of what?
Here, I've got it right here. I can.
Can you show it here? Good.
Yeah, I can show it. Hold on a second. Let me get to the.
Oh, if this comes up.
Which one is over here? To Zoom, and Zoom does this. Well, of course, as soon as you want to do something, it becomes hard to do, right?
Right.
Okay, here we go. Hold on. Share screen. And now we do this. Okay, so this was, can you see that now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so that's Remedios Varo, was a great Spanish surrealist painter who lived most of her life in Mexico. And this painting is called Tres Destinos, painted in 1956. And it seems like the perfect picture of what we're doing right now in the year 2020. At least those of us who are lucky enough to have homes and studios and offices with computers and internet access and colleagues to talk to and so on. And, you know, this sense of being, you know, together, isolated, but in an interconnected world out there with all those little alembics and Klein bottles and so on is really interesting to me.
What does Tres Destinos mean? Three what?
Three destinies.
Oh, I see.
And what is important, or what I see in this, is that North Star, which is then providing the interaction between the three destinies. And if anything that cybernetics is going to do is look at the level that all of a sudden the terrorist is working on, and Pico then all of a sudden did it to a different level, a different gestalt. So we need to look at the communications and the little engine that goes in the center there of all the connected interactions. But those interactions are within a larger paradigm that can be shifted or not. But that is invisible. So it's not just observation orientation, it is observation orientation, and how do you get into that orientation or change that orientation that changes the perceptual interaction. That's a challenge.
Yeah, I think one thing that we really need to think about, and I don't have the answer to it, is we really have to get rid of the word cybernetics. You know, when Norbert Wiener came up with cybernetics in whatever it was, 1946, he said that he deliberately wanted to create a brand new word that had no prior associations, so that people could create a new science out of this. And of course, what happens now is cybernetics in the popular imagination, meaning even, you know, if I mention the word cybernetics to highly educated people who've read a lot and who know a lot but aren't part of these kinds of discussions, they think cybernetics has to do with evil robots or something like that. And you know, what people see in the newspapers is terms like cyber warfare and that sort of thing. And you know, it illustrates any word that you might invent, of course, is eventually going to get muddied up with misuse. And so all words have to be transitory and temporary and replaced every once in a while. But I think this one really needs to go. I mean, you know, systems theory, systems thinking is more communicative to more people, but as we know, that's that has its own set of adherents and ideas. There's a young woman in Japan, Kiki Ogawa, who translates cybernetics as the art of steering, literal translation of the word, and that's pretty good. But we really need a word for this that will be the new word for cybernetics, because these insights are so important, and the sense of not only knowing that the world is an interconnected web of communication, but that by pursuing these lines of inquiry that we're interested in, that you understand how those lines of communications work and what their patterns are. I mean, this is terribly, terribly important. Gregory Bateson really uttered the word cybernetics with this kind of religious feeling almost, that he felt that this was the tool for altering our perception of the world. But the word itself really has to change. I don't know if you guys have any ideas about that.
Physics is based upon understanding of entropy. Living systems is based upon, and this is a term coined by Jerry Chandler, who hopefully will be part of our group in the future, who works from the chemistry, biochemistry world and understands the art of organization like no one else that I've ever seen. He talks about not entropy, but syntropy, the organizational sciences of how we organize patterns. So it's not just patterns, it's how you structure patterns, and that's the unique human capacity to take that far star, North Star, and change its orientation, direction, capacity, so it's not determinative of our future. Because what's important about cybernetics in living systems, it's all about history. It's all about circuits that we've formed, pathways that we have run previously that become habitual, that become our reality.
Yeah. And it has to be a word that has the potential to communicate to a lot of people. Because I've been to just a few of the American Society of Cybernetics meetings over the last 30 years, maybe 3 of them or 4. But there are always 50 people or 75 people. And I guess, from what I hear, the membership is still about 75 people. Exactly. And if we want to say to a wider subset of the human race that these ideas are important and have to do with survival, we need to find a way to, the ideas of feedback and so forth are easily communicable, but we need to find a word that communicates to lots of different kinds of people.
If I could just bring up one book, it was done by Stuart Brand in 1974 called Two Cybernetic Futures. Frontiers, I'm sorry. Right. He talked about the MIT laboratory where they had huge mainframe computers and they were playing sort of a Star Wars of taking ships and shooting at one another. Now, Stuart Brand in 1974 made several predictions. One is that the gaming world will overtake the revenues of all movies, all entertainments, and indeed it has. He made the prediction that sports is not just a nice form of entertainment, it will become the entertainment and distraction from living, which it has become until COVID came along. The first frontier that he talks about is Gregory Bateson, and he says there's something about the way Bateson looks at the world and Mead that the interaction between a mother and a child that's orienting that child with categories, with ways of seeing, ways of being, that will be more revolutionary than any entertainment, any Star Wars, any distraction. And going back to the point about survivability and ability of humans to survive, in an interview by Stuart Brand of Mead and Bateson, Bateson came up with this very interesting term, which we should have a session on, which are lethal variables. What are the lethal variables in a system that cause it to collapse versus move, evolve, change? And so the issues of social change, social revolution, social interaction needs to look at what's a lethal variable lever that I'm pulling now that we may see in our world today, and that we should be very cautious about pulling that lever. Because in that same article, they're talking about, and this was in Coevolutionary Quarterly, they're talking about from the cybernetics meetings of the Macy, the low-hanging fruit of technology was great because it sped up our engines. We are steaming along with this engine, but the headlights of our understanding mean we cannot see the bridges out in front of us. So how do we sit there and increase our illumination of, and this is a reflexive system, of who we are, how we design our technologies, and how we ride them?
What you talk about, the lethal variable, I prepared a little slides and I made a proposal to bring up a new term called actome. Following the transition of perceptron, we need something called actome. But we're running out of time today. I think I had a little 5 slides presentation. Jamie had another one, and Laura, do you also have one? So we probably have to do a follow-up session.
Yeah.
And the next blank time is Wednesday, September 16th. Would you guys willing to get together on that Wednesday to continue what is left today?
Sure.
So let's see if I am able to summarize what we're looking at. There is a concept of lethal variables. There's a concept of how do we repackage our thinking differently to the entropy, to the physics, handmaiden, science, mathematics. How else would people want to phrase our task for the 16th? Dina?
Well, you had a title called "What is System Change?" It's still not fully covered yet, so we can keep using that if you.
Okay, well, what is systems change? And then the twist is, how do you bring it all down? How do you play Samson and destroy your enemies and destroy yourself?
I like always a phrase by Niklas Luhmann from 1982 or so, where he states, what is at stake is to bring together a general theory of communication, a general theory of evolution, and a general theory of society.
Ooh, that's impressive. So communication, evolution, and science.
And society.
Yeah, and I would add very important the family system where it all begins. And there is actually a book that already discusses the lethal variable, published in 1935. According to me, it discusses the lethal variable. It's Ian Suttie. He's a British psychoanalyst of the object relations tradition. And he talks, you mentioned the relation between the mother and the child, how that relation, depending how it evolves, is the introduction of hate as a strong emotion that can take over as the lethal variable. So it stresses the family system as a key system that needs to be acknowledged in how it interacts with all the other systems, basically.
And if I could ask, Jamie, last time you gave your Russian dolls of family systems community systems. Up
They
to
were
9.
not Russian dolls. That's very, very important. They were a circle of systems with non-claiming dominance.
Okay.
But yeah,
Okay, I think we have our tasks. And Jason, Friday you have a session going. I know others can't participate. But...
Friday is Lloyd, because the time was picked up by him. Lloyd can do it on Friday, September 4th. And it was a discussion currently we only have a 3-person, he, me, myself, and Bernard Scott. And so you guys are all welcome if you have time to jump in. That's coming Friday. And next Wednesday, previously it was scheduled for Jamie asking questions to Stuart. But if you like, we can switch with the continuum of this one.
yeah.
You want to do that?
I think that's a good idea, and I move that other one up to whenever. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we will do on next Wednesday, September 9, a follow-up session of today's session. And actually, Jamie had prepared a slide. I had some very good slide as well that I'm eager to show you. So, Laura, you want to do something as well on the next Wednesday to follow up?
I can add a couple slides. Yes.
Yeah. So we had 3-person, and we welcome whoever will jump in as the 4th person. And my observation is what you call the speed dating of ideas. Now we starting become a slow play, which is much more enjoyable.
Yes, I'm really liking it. I have to say, so I can't be here on Fridays, but I'll certainly be here next Wednesday. My observation from the one group that I attended 2 weeks ago, and this one, is this time we had 2 presentations of 10 minutes apiece, and that filled up 2 hours with discussion, and it felt like that was plenty. So I think, and I find that the group interaction among this group is really great. And so I would urge us to stick to maybe 2 presentations at a time and stick to the 10 minutes. And that seems to fill up 2 hours very, very nicely. And it feels like a lot happened today, and that was very satisfying.
And sometime we need, and this will be my final comment, a recording secretary or someone that's sort of taking some notes. We have the record in the video that's being recorded, but some way we need to start pulling this together, because we're still in the exploration mode. What's the map of this unknown minds we're trying to map? And then we need to be coming back down to, bullet points, etc. We can go to some funding agency and person to then make it robust of what questions and queries we're coming up with.
We need to have a secretary.
Okay.
Let's see.
Farewell.
Stephen wants to be one.
Go.
No, he's saying farewell.
I'm saying
thank you all. This is really precious. This is wonderful.
I'm saying I've got to go, but it's been a pleasure to see you guys, and I'll see you next week. So, ciao for now.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, me too. It's great to see you all again. Next week, next time.